Right, a very warm welcome to everyone. Gosh, I sound louder than I should. All right, so it's wonderful to have all of you here today. There are basically three good reasons why we're all here today. Number one, maybe you can make this a little softer. Yeah. Number one, that we are all in the Darbar Hall of this fascinating building. It's a shame that most Mumbaikars have not visited the town hall, have not been a part of this fabulous structure here, which has been renovated recently. And I think that one of the huge attempts of the Asiatic Society now is to get more and more people involved, more and more people to come here to the Asiatic and to really enjoy the fabulous books and the collection of maps, the wonderful amount of treasures which they have here. So I hope that in the years to come, more and more people will become members here, will start using it. We have plans of being able to air condition this place and also put in a lift and also get the many of the books digitized, restored. It can only happen if the people of the city start demanding it, accepting it, and also using it. So that's the first reason why we're here. The second reason is that Aspen, which does a lot of work, the Ananta Aspen Centre, which does a lot of work in only Calcutta and Delhi, has been shying away from Mumbai. But as you know, Maya Nagari, Mumbai has got to invite you, otherwise you can't really get anywhere. So this is one of the attempts of Mumbai to get the Ananta Aspen Centre. Kiran Pasricha is not here today, but she is really the one who is the driving force behind it. She's in Delhi right now, trying to sort out some huge problems that have come her way, but nothing serious problems that she deals with all the time. But the Aspen think tank really internationally works with a few large thoughts and ideas, which is that really what is a good society and a good community all about? What is happiness, and really how should you be seeking happiness and fulfillment in your life? So somewhere also these lectures that we're going to conduct here are with the attempt of actually exploring some of these ideas and some of these thoughts. And the third fabulous reason why we're here is Dr. Tharoor. It's really wonderful that we have here the person who is truly a citizen of the world. He has traveled all over the globe. He speaks multiple languages. He communicates with a lot of people. At one time, he had the highest following on Twitter amongst any Indian politician. But really, more than a politician, he has been a peacekeeper. He has been a refugee worker. He's a journalist. He's an author. He's a diplomat. He is also a minister of parliament. He writes fabulously well. Immense amount of wit in the way he can make humdrum everyday things look interesting, exciting. And his recent book, India Shastra, it spares nobody. It takes everyone on the dock and questions them, asks them. So I hope that all of you will get a chance to read the book and enjoy it. And I hope that all of you will keep on coming back for any of the seminars and sessions that we have here at the Asiatic Library, and keep coming back and keep enjoying this space, enjoying the talk. And also with us, we have in conversation with Dr. Tharoor, we have James Crabtree. More about him is in this booklet, which I'm sure all of you have. And he is the Financial Times correspondent and head here in India. And we've got Manjeet Kripalani, who is again a think tank activist, shall I say? Okay. I'm going to say activist because I hope that James and Manjeet don't spare Dr. Tharoor today. We want questions, we want fabulous answers, we want to spare nobody, we want to get a lot of excitement coming out of this talk today. So enjoy yourself and keep coming back for more. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aditya Vikram Somani, and great to see you all here. When Aditya talked about the three good reasons to be here, I assumed he meant Manjeet Kripalani, James Crabtree, and me. But I must join him in saying that this splendid building, which we have just seen a good part of, is such a wonderful advertisement for our colonial heritage, I suppose, James, but also really for our efforts since independence to preserve and maintain this extraordinary institution. So my congratulations to the Asiatic Society, for keeping this going so in such a lovely way, and our thanks, my thanks for having us here. I'm also a trustee of the Ananta Aspen Centre, so I'm very happy to be here at their invitation. I have to admit, it's a bit late in the day for the book, which came out in January, but Ananta Aspen Centre was very keen on being active in Mumbai and reaching out to a thinking and reflective Mumbai audience, and so I was quite willing to offer up my ideas and my words as the source of an Ananta Aspen event. Here in this discussion, I'm told the idea is that I should say a few words of introduction, not very many, that I'll then hand over to each of the others, and they will say what they wish to say and then grill me as they wish to, and we just have a conversation, which in due course we hope all of you will join with your own questions and comments. But very simply, this book, India Shastra Reflections on the Nation in Our Time, was put together, in a sense, a little earlier than I'd intended. It's become de facto the third of a trilogy of books about India, about trying to understand, interpret, and explain contemporary India. The first was India from Midnight to the Millennium, which was written in 1997, published in the 50th anniversary year of India's independence, and which covered a sort of the grand sweep of Indian politics, society, culture, and economics since independence. Then 10 years later, at the importunate insistence of my publishers, I put together subsequent writings since India from Midnight to the Millennium in a book that was called The Elephant, the Tiger, and the Cell Phone, which tried to trace the continuing transformation of India thereafter. And in the ordinary course, I should have waited for the 70th or even the 75th anniversary, but when the Modi election occurred last year, with the sea change it was seen as representing, my new publisher, David Davidaru, was also my old publisher, because he was the publisher at Viking Penguin who talked me into writing what became India from Midnight to the Millennium. He said this was really the right time to take stock. There was no point waiting for an artificial date on the calendar, because we'd then be in the middle of something Mr. Modi was trying to do. This was the time to do it. So the book's timing, to some degree, has been advanced by the election results of last year. But it's more than just a book about Mr. Modi and what he's trying to do. That occupies the first third or so of the volume. The first 6 months of the Modi era are covered in some detail, including his foreign policy efforts. And the introduction, which was written just before Christmas, will give you my sense of the overall directions of the Modi experiment thus far. And I'm happy to share that with you in a minute. But beyond that, the book attempts to look at various other elements of what we can call national stock-taking. One was certainly the quick look at the overall inheritance, the legacy that today's Indian leaders are grappling with from the British rule onwards, and some of the great leaders who've come and gone before. There are sections on essentially what UPA has done. You won't be surprised to know that I think the UPA got what the Americans call a bum rap, an undeservedly bad press, especially in the last few years of their tenure. And I think a lot of transformational things were done, which I've talked about and I'm happy to discuss. But then there are also other pieces about our society, about everything from whether you should be allowed to wear dhotis to clubs in Chennai or Mumbai or Calcutta, to essays on the education system, and then a final section which is slightly more discursive, ranging from the joys of flying while brown, all the airport security hassles all of us have gone through who've had to venture abroad, as well as off-takes on such only partly related to India issues like Bobby Jindal and whether we should or shouldn't be proud of him, as some people rashly said they were, and a concluding riff on birthdays. So as you can see, there's a collection of somewhat different thoughts and ideas in the book. It's the kind of book you can dip into and return to at your leisure, because the topics are fairly different, though they're grouped together more or less coherently. And the idea is to give the reader today a portrait of today's India, taking into account what has led up to it. Sorry, I did take longer than I intended to, but the idea is very much that that's what this book is all about. But in many ways, it represents my testament, my sort of set of ideas and values about what makes India, what should continue to make it, what has failed it, what my hopes are, and so on. On Mr. Modi, very briefly, before we get into the substance of the conversation, my concerns expressed in a text written in December, I'm afraid, seem all the more valid now in July, which is that we have a prime minister who talks a good game, but doesn't appear to match the slogans and the vision that he articulates with a credible budget, an implementation plan, or an executing capacity to implement it. And there are chairs here, sir, for those of you who've just come in and are standing in the back. My worry has always been that there is such a vast gap between action and implementation in India, between words or rhetoric and reality, and that has been accentuated. The budget that was introduced subsequent to this book's coming out, and therefore subsequent to the budget discussion in this book, was a classic example of what I'm talking about. So you've got ambitious programs like the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan that actually has less funding than the considerably less ambitious UPA sanitation program. And that's true literally across the board. Make in India is a rebaptizing of the national manufacturing policy, but there's been no new changes or reforms when it comes to labor laws or licensing policies or inspection regulations or whatever to make in India any easier than in the earlier days, and so on and so forth. So the concern remains that we have a government by photo op, sound bites, breaking news headlines, and very little tangible transformation on the ground. That is my analysis. Many of you may disagree, and I'm very happy to engage with you. But initially, to engage with Manjeet and James on what they'd like to say about the book and grill me on. So over to you both.
Thank you very much, Shashi. It's a pleasure to be here. As you can tell, I've taken, both of us have been taking notes, so we really are going to grill you. But first things first, today is an amazing day. We may have a government by photo op, but a deal has been struck on Iran. And is this a new world order, the one that we've been long awaiting, and what does it mean really for India, and how would you, if you were running the government, how would you take advantage of it?
Well, I think what we should have taken advantage of was the time when the Iranians didn't have a deal. And I must say, I think the government has not done a very good job in the last year of getting the Iranians to sign deals with us on more advantageous terms than they would be inclined to offer today, when the prospect of the sanctions being lifted makes them obviously a much more accessible player. Of course, the deal isn't yet a done deal, in the sense that from the American point of view, the US Senate still has to ratify it. And as you know, there are a lot of skeptical voices in the US Senate and a lot of politicians in America willing to play politics with that. So we'll have to see whether either the American hardliners or the Iranian hardliners can still kill it. But yes, I would agree with you. This is a historic breakthrough. From India's point of view, as I said, missed opportunity. Of course, Iranian goods and Iranian oil will come into the market. Once sanctions are lifted, which again is not automatic, there are processes to be gone through. But once sanctions are lifted and people can trade with Iran again, one of the most significant things for them will be that they can trade in dollars once more. Whereas, as you know, they've accumulated a few billion rupees in our country from having sold us oil that we can only pay for in rupees, and they don't know how to spend here. So either they're going to buy an awful lot of Bombay real estate, or we're going to have to find creative ways of repatriating that money back to them. But that apart, I must say, I don't see any particularly good things coming out for India. Because India, by being able to have a viable relationship with Iran, at a time when Iran was being isolated by the rest of the world and sanctioned, actually had an opportunity to do more with Iran than it will now have an opportunity to do when everybody is able to deal with Iran. New World Order, I've heard that phrase, unfortunately, a little too often. I heard it first from George W. Bush Sr., George, the father, George Bush 41, as he was called. And that was a premature statement. It was accompanied, not his fault, but much hubris by people, by American thinkers like Charles Krauthammer and so on, who talked about the unipolar moment. And the idea behind the New World Order concept was a New World Order led by a single superpower. Now that era is over. It already was beginning to be over with the rise of China. I'm hesitant to see larger meanings in individual isolated events. One of the consequences of Iranian oil becoming more generally available is going to be either a further plummeting of oil prices, which I think would be very good for oil importing countries, but fairly catastrophic for a number of Middle Eastern nations, or a serious cutback on oil production by the Arabs in order to drive the price up a bit, because right now the strategy that was attempted by the OPEC countries of reducing oil prices to a point that shale oil would become unviable has been complicated by the entry of a wholly new player into the market. So all of these things I think will have to be paused for and analyzed, but I am hesitant to hail the birth of a new world order. The world, I think, is much as it was before Bush first used the phrase, and will be, I think, in the years to come as well.
Now, Manjeet and I decided that we'd go back and forth and ask a question each. So Shashi was getting it from both sides, although she's badly shown me up, because as you can see, my copy of Shashi's book doesn't have the careful annotations that Manjeet has shown off with. So she's been a better student than I have. But let's stick with foreign policy. I mean, the book really is extraordinary for its breadth, for those of you who haven't read it, ranging from assessments of the Indian founding fathers through to Shashi's time as a UN diplomat, through to all manner of topics, and with an extensive section on Mr. Modi. But sticking to foreign policy, in the assessments of the first year of the Prime Minister, as your background is largely in foreign policy, the general consensus was 5 out of 10 on domestic policy, maybe, something like that, but 10 out of 10 on foreign policy. You saw this again and again, that the government had done very well, reset relations with America, made friends in the neighborhood. Mr. Modi is a public diplomat of some standing, able to command great crowds. And I suppose I thought I'd poke you with a stick a little bit. I mean, do you agree with this consensus that the government has, whatever you think of its economic policy, which we'll get onto, has had a pretty stellar set of achievements in... indeed, actually, there is a chapter in which Shashi is very nice about Sushma Swaraj and her early trips to Afghanistan, for instance. So you've been complimentary of some elements of the government. But do you agree with this consensus that their first year of foreign policy has been a great triumph?
Yes and no. I'll explain that. The yes part is that Mr. Modi has brought a lot of personal energy and dynamism into his own engagement, even if some of this extensive traveling may have to do with, if you like, a certain amount of personal rehabilitation after many years of being ostracized and treated as a pariah by so many foreign countries. He's now not just acceptable, but the elected leader of 1.2 billion people, and he's relishing that, and that's part of it. But beyond that, he has been a very effective, as you say, public diplomatist. He's out there, he's been to 24 countries as of today, and he's had a good knack for making a visual impact, for saying the right things and impressing his audiences. All of that, I think, is to his credit. And the second thing that I'd give high marks for is for the elements of continuity in Indian foreign policy from what we've seen of the BJP in opposition. Having attacked the UPA consistently, including on foreign policy, the BJP has come to power under Mr. Modi and done everything that it attacked the UPA for doing. So from the Indo-US nuclear deal and the additional protocol which it signed, to the Bangladesh land boundary agreement, you have example after example of issues that the BJP ferociously opposed when in opposition. You may remember on the Indo-US nuclear deal, they even brought a vote of no confidence in the government and parliament. But they have actually upheld the wisdom of everything that the UPA government did. And I give them full marks for continuity and 0 out of 10 for consistency. Thank God, because if they had been consistent with their positions in opposition, they would have been absolutely disastrous for the country. So that continuity is something I praise, and their willingness to accept the error of their previous positions and adopt the right stance is fine. Where I am troubled is particularly on Pakistan policy, where there is a level of policy incoherence that can only be considered dangerous. It was bad enough when I wrote the book. It's been much worse in the 6 months since. You start off with Mr. Modi, the same Mr. Modi who attacked the Congress government for feeding chicken biryani to visiting Pakistanis, inviting Mr. Nawaz Sharif for his inauguration. You then have the sari shawl diplomacy, and exchanging fond greetings to each other's mothers and all of that, which is then followed by dramatic escalation in artillery fire on the line of control, with Indian soldiers being retaliated to retaliate out of proportion to Pakistani shelling. Then you have suddenly a decision to have foreign secretary level talks. Then you have that decision rescinded because the Pakistanis did something they've always done before, which is talk to the Hurriyat. Then you have the Kathmandu SARC, where the President of Pakistan walks past the Indian Prime Minister, who's ostentatiously reading a brochure in order not to have to say hello to him. Then you have the Foreign Secretary being sent off to Pakistan on a SARC yatra. Then you have the Prime Minister of India telephoning his Pakistani counterpart to wish him good luck before the World Cup, considering the match he was calling before was India versus Pakistan. I think that must have been the most insincere diplomatic greeting in the history of India-Pakistan relations. The last thing we wanted the Pakistanis to have was good luck in that particular occasion. But anyway, so you've seen all of this, and now you've seen, without any warning or preparation or discussion, this so-called summit at Ufa, which is then promptly discredited the day after by statements emanating from Islamabad. So what is the coherent vision, or is there one? And I think one has to say that this is dangerously irresponsible. It was all very well for the BJP to acknowledge that they were wrong to consistently oppose everything we did on Pakistan. And so a change was desirable. But you can't change every other day, because you are the government of a nuclear power, and you're dealing with another hypersensitive nuclear power on your borders. So I'm afraid there's some very serious amount of homework that a responsible government needs to do that I don't believe this government has done. So I fall, I'm afraid, a long way short of that 10 on 10 that your friends want generously to give Mr. Modi on foreign policy.
Gosh. Is there anyone here who's listening to this? But your book has been wonderful in really summarizing, as James said, it's really expansive. But some of the things that you write about, particularly about colonialism and how it impacted India, etc., you write about the colonial scam on education and how the British really, sorry James, we have to go through this. We have to rewrite our history. So my question is really that when will we get our own history being rewritten? We're in this magnificent library, and I'm sure there's documentation here, which is not all British, but maybe Indian, and there are libraries of the old Maharajas that are locked up. Are we ever going to get a chance to write our own history, and who will do it?
But you see, Manjeet, I would argue that history can be modified with the possessive pronoun. In other words, there is my history and your history and her history of the same events. And what we've seen certainly was the British writing a version of Indian history, which has earlier been hotly contested by the so-called nationalist historians who did write an alternative version of history, R.C. Majumdar and people like that. Indeed, if you go back to the founding of the Indian National Congress, it was on an alternative reading of history. And Jawaharlal Nehru's Glimpses of World History is a conscious attempt to reread the entire history of the globe in a different way from the way the colonialists would have done, just as the discovery of India was an attempt to reclaim the narrative of Indian history for an Indian nationalist voice. So it's been done. Today, in fact, we have history being rewritten from yet another perspective. You have the Hindutva movement coming up with some rather passionately, fervently argued, but not entirely well resourced or researched history of their own about the ancient glories of Hindu India as they see it. And you're going to have all of these histories out there. There's the Marxist histories, the subaltern histories, the histories. You talked about the memoirs of Maharajas being locked up, and those can be found. But of course, many argue that it's the voices of the peasantry that was never heard, and trying to dig some of that up with the subaltern history movement. So there's a lot happening out there in that field, and I'm not too worried. What we do have to slightly worry about is the way in which every time you have a change of government, you have a new set of people writing the official histories. So the Indian Council for Historical Research has been completely reconstituted. We have a new head of the ICHR who's most famous for arguing that the Ramayana and Mahabharata are literally accurate works of history and not mere myths, and they should therefore be treated as historical works. And he's the head of the ICHR. You also have, of course, in some cases, state school textbooks being rewritten. So these are important concerns and important questions. But beyond that, I wouldn't worry too much, because as far as other kinds of histories are being written, they will continue to be, they will be, and they are being written from a variety of perspectives.
There's a strikingly strident chapter in Shashi's book about the legacy of British colonialism, and I'll be giving no secrets away to let you know that he doesn't think my lot were much good. He even includes the famous old joke that the reason why the sun never set on the British Empire was that no one would ever trust a British man in the dark. But the question of history brings us on neatly to, I mean, you just mentioned it, the worries about Mr. Modi's government and the influence of the sort of Hindu nationalist component in the RSS. You mentioned this repeatedly in the opening sort of quarter of the book. And I suppose I wanted to, again, sort of push you on it a little bit, because it seems it's quite a comfortable position for the Congress Party to hold that Mr. Modi might on the outside look like a kind of an economic modernizer, but actually underneath he's what you might not, a saffron in tooth and claw, a sort of fundamentalist, and that he, and I suppose I wonder how potent a criticism of this government that will end up being. A lot of effort is put into painting him personally this way, but my sense is that, I mean, not that I'm a great sort of seer of the mind of Middle India, but my sense is that many people think that he has moved beyond this part of his heritage, and that actually attempting to portray him in this way will end up, at the very least, not getting the opposition very far and potentially being counterproductive. So I wondered whether you saw any sort of truth in that, or whether you really did think that he, as a prime minister, still held these sort of rather fundamentalist beliefs of, you know, a time rather earlier in his life. So.
Right. Now, I will respond to that, but before doing that, I have to rise to the bait that you tossed me at the beginning of your remark. Because I actually, it's not that I don't think the British were up to much good, but as I pointed out in the great Indian novel 25 years previously, the British were the only people in history crass enough to make revolutionaries out of Americans. So you can imagine that for us to rise up against, I mean, what they did in India, for example, was to take the word loot into their habits as well as their dictionaries, so that people like Robert Clive could go around calling themselves Clive of India as if he belonged to the country, when all he really did was to ensure that much of the country belonged to him. So there was no doubt about the rapacity of British colonialism, and each of the things that Britain is supposed to have done good for India, with the exception of preserving books at the Asiatic Society Library, James, has a subtext. The railways, for example, were a celebrated British scam in which an enormous amount of profit was made by British shareholders at the expense of Indian taxpayers. And each kilometre of Indian railway cost 4 times what the same kilometre cost in Australia or Canada, because of the terms under which the British built it, and the guaranteed returns to investors in order to build it. But we can talk about all that separately. Let me get back to James's more serious critique on Modi and our critique of Mr. Modi. You see, don't forget that right up to the dying days of the election campaign, Mr. Modi didn't really entirely let up on the hate speech there was an awful amount of minority bashing and anti-minority signaling even during the elections. But he was careful to ensure that the bulk of his message was an economic development message, granted. And I think that is probably one of the areas in which he did take us unawares, and that he was able to portray himself effectively as the CEO of Gujarat, Inc., who would come and transform India through a driven model of development, while at the same time issuing much more than a nod and a wink to the haters and the bigots on the Hindutva fringes. No question about that, that was there as well. Now, after his election, I will be the first to agree, and I've been pilloried by my own party for saying this, that he has said everything right. There hasn't been one word of hate speech or of anti-minority bashing coming out of his lips at any point in this first year of office. So to that degree, you're right in suggesting he has moved beyond it. But as the Prime Minister of a government, the leader of a nation, and the leader of a party, he needs to do more than just avoid behaving the way he did before. He cannot condone the hate speech and the polarizing conduct and inflammatory rhetoric of many members and leaders of his own party, including people he has appointed to his Council of Ministers. After all, Ramzadeh versus Haramzadeh was said by a Minister of State in the Modi government who has not been disciplined, let alone dismissed, for that egregious statement. And of course, some of the other statements have been made by members of parliament who have prominent positions in the BJP dispensation. The man who wanted to put statues of Nathuram Godse around the country to celebrate the killing of Gandhi has not only been asked by the BJP to lead it in a few debates in parliament, he chairs a committee of parliament. So this is, very much running with the hare and hunting with the hounds kind of thing, where on the one hand, you go to the Catholic Bishops' Conference and say all the right things about Indian tolerance and coexistence, but you allow people who enjoy prominent positions under you to go out and do the opposite. To my mind, this is dangerous and it's unbecoming. The second problem is some of the events that have occurred. I mean, when you have a message to the outside world, come to India and invest, we're just the kind of place you ought to be in. And they're reading in their newspapers about churches being vandalized and Ghar Wapasi movements implying reconversion of people from Islam and Christianity and all of these things happening. How are they going to feel? I speak as a recipient of communications from some potential investors who say, is this the kind of country you want us to put our money into? So in other words, what the BJP and the RSS and the VHP and so on are being allowed to do is actually undermining Mr. Modi's official larger message and the entire approach that he has sought to be elected on. So he's actually doing himself a serious disservice as well. So yes, I believe this critique is relevant, but James, it almost doesn't matter what the critique is. What matters is, if Mr. Modi continues like this, is he going to be able to deliver by 2019 what he promised the electorate that he would deliver in 2014? And judging by the first year, the answer very clearly is no. There has not been one step taken to that would have generated new jobs in this country. I'm not sure that anyone in this audience can stand up and say that my life has changed for the better because of such and such concrete step taken by the BJP government. And this is a worry. It's only 1 year out of 5, and his apologists keep saying, give us more time. But at some point, that time will run out. And when that happens, we'll be ready and waiting.
Manjeet, before you come back in, let me push you on this a bit, because, this is probably it's one of the most interesting and perhaps the fundamental assertion that you make in the opening chapter of the book, that there's a sort of defining paradox of Modiism, which is that on the one hand, the Prime Minister wants to be a modernizing, sort of East Asian, developmentally focused leader, but that he is electorally ensnared in the foot soldiers of his party's movement who are much less economically liberal and who care about things like rewriting school textbooks and reconverting the lost of the flock. And that sort of within this paradox contains the seeds of Modi's destruction. And I suppose the reason why I think how you characterize him matters is that you can recognize that tension, but it isn't clear to me that this is a fundamental tension. It actually seems to me that he will be able to muddle along just as before. Occasionally the head of the RSS will say something annoying, and then occasionally he'll tell him to go back in his box. And, you know, that actually this could continue as a pattern within the government, and the government could still be very popular and still achieve quite a lot. And that what you portray as being the defining contradiction of Modiism may turn out just to be a facet of it that allows him to be very successful. So I wondered if you could sort of say a bit more about why you think this is so important as a way of understanding the way that Modi's government will unfurl.
It's important because Mr. Modi won with 31% of the vote. And of that, I would argue that there would be at least 12, maybe 15 in that 31 who have absolutely no interest in Hindutva, who don't share his message, his earlier message of bigotry, but were attracted by his "I am the efficient CEO" image. I think that explains, certainly the difference between the Congress's 19 and the BJP's 31 cannot be explained purely in terms of Hindu chauvinism, because Hindu chauvinism has always hit a natural ceiling in Indian politics. So given that, it seems to me that if Mr. Modi wants to continue to be the leader of a majority party in parliament, it can only be as somebody who's effective in delivering the results of economic development of this country. It cannot be on the basis of frightening minorities or being, shall we put it bluntly, somebody whose rhetoric has nothing to do with action on the ground. And the truth of the matter with Mr. Modi is that at the moment, he seems to be completely failing to fulfill his own targets. I mean, his speeches have been very impressive in diagnosing from a particular point of view what is wrong with India and suggesting what can be done. But you have never seen a correlated action that will in turn change the problem he's complaining about. So he'll go off and make a speech at some appropriate occasion saying, isn't it terrible that in our country, you know, you need 200 clearances or licenses before you set up a factory, and in country X, Australia, you only need 6 or whatever, and I'm going to change India and bring it down from 200 to 20. And then 9 months later, not one of those 200 licenses or permissions has still been abolished. So this has been the problem with Mr. Modi. There's all this rhetoric, and there's no connection to action on the ground. Now, in parallel, as I've pointed out, there is this contradiction that to win elections, he has a political vehicle, the BJP and its fellow travelers, the RSS and the rest, who are not only profoundly illiberal when it comes to their policy preferences, but who really count on winning elections through the politics of hatred, of bigotry, of polarization. So, on the one hand, he's making all these economic promises to attract votes. He's getting votes, core votes delivered to him through bigotry. And then he's not actually delivering on those economic promises. It seems to me that that is a recipe for disaster from his point of view. That is that by the time the next general elections roll around, the young people who voted for him because they thought they had jobs growing on trees under Mr. Modi and haven't got any jobs coming, and the capitalists who bankrolled him thinking that life was going to be much easier and they'd be growing and prospering, and who have not now so far shown any signs of investing an extra rupee in Indian industry in the last year, they will no longer want to bankroll him, and so on and so forth down, so that in fact the sustainability of this entire argument and the electoral machinery that drives it will be undermined by the very contradiction that he's trying to ride.
But Shashi, how much of that is really dependent on the states rather than the center?
No, that is true that we are a federal country, but there's an awful lot that can be done nationally that hasn't been done. If Mr. Modi had done everything he could do nationally and was only being stuck in certain areas because of the states, then you could accept that analysis. But when there's been so little movement in getting things done, I mean, a lot of regulations can be scrapped to the national level. A lot of them flow from the writing of regulations emerging from national acts. And you can rewrite regulations and re-promulgate them. You don't even need a majority in the Rajya Sabha, which he keeps complaining he doesn't have. So there's a lot of things he could do before he gets to the point of complaining that the states aren't doing them.
Okay. So let's talk, just before you go, the Bombay Municipal Corporation and the Maharashtra Metropolitan Regional Authority have taken a leaf out of the colonial Raj and still stick it to us where they're building roads. They're still padding their books. and overcharging the citizen for an infrastructure that should be coming to us. But in any case, let's talk presidential politics. You talked about Mr. Modi maybe introducing the first style of presidential politics in India. How possible it is? You've got a whole chapter on it.
Well, that's because I have always, and this is when I say always, it goes back about 20 years since I first articulated, no more than that, probably 25 years, my faith that in a country like India, a presidential system might actually be better for us than a parliamentary one. And my conviction deepened during the 20 years of coalition governance that we've seen between 95 and now, until Mr. Modi surprised everybody by winning an absolute majority himself. The reason for this was that my objection to the parliamentary system that we have is that it privileges staying in power over doing anything with power. Because you have to have a coalition in the center. The lowest common denominator politics that comes when the weakest link in the coalition becomes the government's Achilles heel. That is that if you have a policy you want to put forward and one party without which you can't cobble together a majority refuses, then you can't pass the policy. UPA went through this with Trinamool earlier on the Indo-US nuclear deal when it needed the support of the left in parliament. So an awful lot of time is spent by the leaders of the ruling party just in managing the contradictions of coalition governance rather than in doing something for the country. So my first objection was that. My second objection was the parliamentary system. It was this peculiarly British perversion, I know James is really getting it today, of electing a legislature to form the executive, which to my mind made very little sense because while it might have worked in a small island country like Britain, here the legislature involves each of us representing 2 million voters, not the 100,000 that the British MP has to deal with. And these 2 million voters are people whom we obviously see en masse. We do very little one-on-one campaigning. At the same time, we are in a system in which the reason we are getting elected to the legislature is to form the government. And that often means that if you don't succeed in forming the government or being in the majority, you don't have very much to do in parliament or at the central government level, and you can't bring back benefits to the people you represent. With the result that you have legislators who don't really want to legislate, who've got elected because they want to be in the executive. And an executive that is chosen not because they are able, but because they are electable. Because you have to be a member of parliament to be in the executive, to be a minister. To my mind, this is profoundly unfortunate for our country, and indeed this BJP government, which is full of people manifestly unable to cope with the tasks before them as ministers. There is a handful of very impressive ministers, don't get me wrong, but there is a much larger collection of people who are clearly out of their depth, as can be readily apparent at parliamentary question hour. In fact, I think every time the opposition disrupts parliament, they're doing these poor sweating ministers a favor, because the ministers are always looking like, you know, the proverbial deer caught in the headlights when they're asked a question about their own portfolios. But these are all sort of performance-related reasons. Now, the counter-argument has always been, well, a presidential system could lead to dictatorship, to which my answer is, but I want chief executives elected at all levels, not just in Delhi as the President of India, but also the governor or the chief minister of the state must be directly elected, the mayor of the town or the city must be directly elected, the head of the panchayat must be directly elected, so that everybody has an executive responsibility, a clearly defined authority, and a budget to go with it. You know, it's ironic that even in a communist dictatorship like China, if a businessman comes and sees the mayor of a town and says, I want to open this factory, that mayor can give him the permission to open the factory, can assign him the land, the electricity, the sanitation, the roads, the necessary licenses, the permission to transport his goods, and even find him the workers to do the work. Whereas the Indian mayor is a glorified chairman of a municipal committee and has none of these powers, and each of these decisions that one mayor can make in one day in China requires multiple stages and processes in the Indian system. So this is, to my mind, nothing to do with democracy. It has to do with inefficiency. It has to do with the kind of democracy that we are operating. And this is why I've argued in favor of a presidential system. Some people point out that, look, the Americans have a presidential system and they're paralyzed between a Democratic president and a Republican-dominated Congress. But I say that's the beauty of offering the presidential system in India, is that you will never have that kind of paralysis because a two-party system in India is inconceivable. Right now, even in the Modi wave, there are 45 parties represented in parliament. So in a presidential system in India, you'll have a directly elected president who is not vulnerable to a vote of confidence being thrown out of office before the expiry of her term in office. But when she needs to get a piece of legislation through, she can form issue-oriented coalitions amongst the 45 parties. So you can always find enough parties to support one policy or another and get your work done. So I just think it's a much better system. I have to admit, this entire exercise is a purely theoretical one because it ain't going to happen. I mean, the fact is that the change of system requires an amendment to the Constitution, which requires a two-thirds majority in Parliament. And that means that politicians who are themselves most comfortable with the situation that they know how to operate will have to make the decision to abolish it. So you can forget it. It's a purely theoretical conversation, but it was worth having anyway.
Yeah, Shashi calls this a British perversion, but given the peccadillos of my countrymen, if this is the worst British perversion of which we're going to be accused, then I think, you know, the vagaries of the Westminster system, that's fine. So let me turn to the future of your own political party. I mean, you, of course, I'm sure will tell us that the Congress party has had its foot on Mr. Modi's throat since day one. I mean, to my view, there has been some moderate signs of life over the last few months, but it seems that the party is faced with a sort of contradiction over the critique that it wants to make of Mr. Modi, that on the one hand, he is accused of being much too efficient, stealing farmers' land and generally being a friend of rapacious industrialists. And at the same time, he is accused of being, as you just did, totally inefficient, doing absolutely nothing, you know, sitting idly by and occasionally having the odd photo opportunity. And it strikes me that you may be able to make both of those critiques at the same time, but it requires an act of sort of gymnastics to do so. And in the end, you need to pick one of them. And I suppose I wondered, when you think about the future of the Congress party and how you want the party to develop, which argument would you be making and which of these critiques do you think has the most power?
Well, actually, James, I don't know if the argument is in the book, it may not be, but there's an argument that encapsulates why the seemingly contradictory analysis that you explained is actually the right one, which is this question about how Mr. Modi, you know, when he began, he startled everybody by meeting directly with the secretaries of the government of India without the ministers. And I was in those days a Congress spokesman, and I said that we used to have empowered groups of ministers. Mr. Modi has now given us disempowered ministers because he's bypassing the responsibility in the cabinet system of government that ministers are supposed to have, and he's going straight to the secretaries, the bureaucrats. But lo and behold, so you can see that as an example of hands-on efficient management by Mr. Modi. But in terms of delivering results, it's had a calamitous effect. Because what's happening is his direct involvement with the secretaries, all that is ensured is that they play fewer rounds of golf and they are careful to be seen by everybody to be working in the office till after 9 p.m. If you have a friend amongst the secretaries of the government of India and you invite him for dinner, be sure that he will not come till after 9, and he will make it a point to call at about 8:30 saying, I'm still at the office, I'm so sorry, you know. And I've been at so many parties where this has happened, it's become a bit of a joke. This has been the kind of effectiveness. But when it comes to actually authority, decision-making, and efficient movement of government, nothing has happened. The bureaucrats will privately tell you that all files go to the Prime Minister's office, where they simply pile up, because there are too many files that have to be decided at the Prime Minister's office level, and obviously limited human capacity to deal with all of them. And so you have precisely the contradiction that James was talking about, a seemingly efficient hands-on manager who doesn't deliver any results because of the bureaucratic delays engendered by his own style of management, QED. So both critiques are valid. But having said that, I mean, you also asked, where is our revival coming from? And I feel I should speak up for that. It has already begun. And I will admit that we got off to a slow start. I think that in the first few months after Mr. Modi swept to power, we did not have our feet on his throat. But certainly in the last few months, before today, we've seen tremendous examples of effective opposition, which is why the BJP is now so much on the defensive. And though the BJP successfully caricatured Rahul Gandhi negatively for some time, his performance over the last few months has surprised his worst critics, both in terms of his leadership of the party in Parliament, which has not been in the past his natural theatre, but where he has made some very effective speeches laden with extempore confidence and wit and repartee. But he's also gone off and led the party throughout the country, and not traveling, in private aircraft surrounded by Z+ security, but taking second-class trains, chatting to families, sharing the compartment with them, sharing his food with them and theirs, and eating theirs, going off to sit in fishermen's huts and discussing their problems, actually meeting with people who've experienced real difficulties with some of the agrarian policies of this government, the farmers, and so on and so forth. And you're seeing the emergence already in year one, which is earlier than many expected, of a very effective opposition that has put the BJP government on the back foot. And I would say in the next 4 years, you're going to see much more of that. So I'm not too pessimistic.
If Manjeet would, let me press you just a little more on that. It seems to me that Modi is a more sort of sophisticated or not, it's not quite the right word, but a more sort of profound opponent for the Congress party for a number of reasons. Primarily that he appears to have learned from the mistakes of the Vajpayee government in how they presented themselves as sort of insufficiently friendly to the mass of the poor of India. You in the book call this the Nerubian Consensus, and the Congress is the holder of the Nerubian Consensus, which is that the government must act primarily in the interests of the downtrodden. And while Modi has certainly not outed himself as a liberal, as you would describe yourself, he has adopted a pro-poor rhetoric. His policies, he hasn't been very radical in what many of his outriders would like him to do of slashing subsidies. In fact, he tends to have been relatively generous. And he's even gone so far as appropriating many of the signs and symbols of Congress India, as anyone who looks at Mr. Gandhi's glasses on the Swachh Bharat campaign, they're quite crafty in the way that they're trying to steal important components of the Congress party's identity, your selling point. And so I suppose I wondered how profound a challenge do you think that is? Because it looks very deliberate to me and would be, I think he presents an existential threat to the Congress party.
Oh, existential threat is a bit too dramatic. I would say that he is an extremely crafty, clever opponent to have, and that will keep us on our toes. You're right about the Gandhi appropriation, because those of you who have read the works of the Hindutva movement know that Gandhi was reviled by the Hindu Mahasabha and the RSS for decades. And the Bharatiya Jansangh, the precursor of the Bharatiya Janata Party, never had a good word to say about Mahatma Gandhi, even on his centenary. And now suddenly you're finding Prime Minister Modi laying claim to the Gandhian legacy and speaking about Gandhi everywhere. He goes abroad and makes speeches about Gandhi, because he's concluded that indeed appropriating Gandhi is essential, and that Gandhi is part of sort of the soft power of India that he wishes to leverage abroad. Very striking, and that is interesting. Similarly, his ability to learn from his mistakes. The pinstripe suit was an egregious example. It wasn't there in the book because he hadn't worn it yet, but he wore it, as you know, on Republic Day, and this was shortly before the Delhi elections. And it seemed to encapsulate everything that was wrong with the Modi government in this regard. That is, that he was clearly, that pinstripe suit with his name embossed in gold seemed to speak, first of all, of somebody who was completely out of touch with people, completely obsessed with himself and his own glory, and at the same time, somebody who had lost that sort of finger on the pulse that he had been famously good at having earlier. Well, the credit I will give Mr. Modi is that he did learn from that mistake. And after the setback of the Delhi polls, as you know, one of the first things he did was to auction that pinstripe suit. And I dare say we will never see him in anything like that again, as long as he's Prime Minister. So clearly he can learn, and it's always better to have an opponent who keeps making the same mistake over and over again than to have an opponent who learns from his mistakes. So the Congress party will have to be on its toes because Mr. Modi does learn from his mistakes. But he still stands for the wrong things in our society. He is somebody who has for too long in his political career enshrined bigotry and the politics of hatred in ways that it's very difficult, I think, for us to allow ourselves to forget. And we should offer a credible alternative of a different kind of politics, which I believe he's going to make it easier for us to do by his inability to deliver concrete results. What is he going to campaign on in 2019, if not his track record for 5 years? And if the track record is not measurably useful, he is more likely, and his party is more likely, to seek refuge again in the politics of division and of bigotry and of hatred. Not good for the country. This is not what India needs. So I remember saying some time ago when he was elected that if Mr. Modi succeeds, as an Indian I'll be happy, and if Modi fails as a congressman I'll be happy. The fact is that obviously every Indian wants the country to survive and succeed and prosper. And if Mr. Modi delivers that, it'll be bad for us politically, but it'll be good for the country. But we're not seeing any evidence of that, and that's why my critique, which may come from a different set of premises than some of my party colleagues, still ends up being a critique because he's not delivering results.
So I think we should do Q&A. Maybe we have a few minutes, Aditya. Maybe about 10 minutes of Q&A because we have interesting people in the audience. Yeah? 5 minutes? Okay. James,
There's a lady there. Is there a mic for the audience? And you can give the second mic to whoever else asks so we can save time. There's another hand there. Could you hold the mic closer to yourself? Oh, it's not on.
Hello.
Yeah, that's on.
There is a mic there coming your way.
Hello.
Hold it closer, much closer.
Would you say that Mr. Modi is a better foreign minister than a prime minister? And part of the fault lies in his choice of finance minister. You know what you've been saying about that what is ailing the economy, he hasn't got on with all his promises which he made, and the speeches that he gives, you don't see action on the ground. Would you say there's something, the fault lies in his choice of finance minister rather than...
I don't want to reduce it to personalities, not least since the finance minister is somebody I was at university with all those many decades ago. But let me say that on the foreign minister thing, yes, there is this critique that Mr. Modi is a real foreign minister and that Mrs. Swaraj is the Minister for Consular Affairs, as somebody disparagingly put it the other day. But I'm not sure that's entirely fair, because in every country today, in the era of global communications, of easy direct contact between heads of government, and therefore a frequent summitry, you do find that in every country, the principal voice in foreign policy is usually that of the head of government. That wasn't the case in the days when communications were much more difficult and heads of government met relatively infrequently, perhaps once a year, perhaps even less. And therefore foreign ministers had the job of jetting around the world and maintaining those links. Today, there are so many occasions. I imagine that in this first 12 months, Mr. Modi must have met Mr. Xi at least 5 times in the BRICS summit, the SCO summit, the BRICS summit in Brazil, the BRICS summit in Ufa, the SCO summit, and the 2 bilateral visits. So that's 5 meetings right there between the head of government of India and the head of government of China. I mean, 10 years ago, and certainly 20, 30, 40 years ago, that was inconceivable. So in these situations, particularly the big ticket foreign policy items will often always be done by prime ministers or presidents. That tends to happen. And therefore, I'm not sure that it would be fair entirely to disparage Ms. Swaraj's contribution. She still has to run the ministry to take care of all the other issues the PM doesn't have time for, and she's been doing that reasonably well. I mean, it's a shame about her conflict of interest, which was unfortunate and which certainly undermines the good work she's done in other areas. But I think the problem should not be reduced to one of individuals. It has to be seen in terms of what the government is doing, how it's doing it, and with what results. And there I would say the BJP is sadly lacking. Manjeet, will you play traffic cop? And yes, go ahead.
You touched
And I think the way to do it would be while one person's asking a question, the other mic travels.
Yeah.
So we'll save time.
So just a quick, short question, please. Thank
You touched briefly on the colonial legacy in the education system and its reference to history. But is there a lot more in the education system, whether from the colonial legacy or whatever, which has really not been addressed by our governments, whether the UPA or the present government?
There is, and I'm sorry to tell you, there are about 30 pages in the book on that subject. So I wouldn't want to try and do injustice to my arguments by summarizing them too briefly. There is an awful lot at school education level, at higher education level, and in terms of vocational and skill development level that I've analyzed in the book. There's so much that needs to be done. We in the Congress government, I think, did not do a bad job of the diagnosis. We even got the prescription more or less right, we just couldn't get it done. For various reasons, including in the end the time available. I think UPA 2 was really the first time that we really made a serious push in transforming education, and we ran into a lot of roadblocks, some of which I've mentioned quite candidly in the book. But our education system is over-regulated and under-governed at the higher education level, and it's emphasized quantity over quality at the lower level. And we need to get both of those right desperately, because there's nothing more dangerous to the future of India than legions of undereducated, unemployed, and unemployable young men who, frankly, are what the Naxalite movements in many districts are all about. These are people who become prey to the blandishments of the 1,000 rupees and a Kalashnikov kind of thing, because they can have no other stake in our society and economy because we haven't equipped them to take advantage of it. We've got to get that right. Oh, they've given the mic to someone. Oh, there's a mic here.
Hello. So in the communal climate that is spread in our country, what mechanisms would you suggest to instill tolerance?
Well, you know, it's a very difficult thing to answer. Obviously, the education system is part of it. It has to be coexistence and not judging people by their religion, their caste, their community, etc., has to be instilled into every Indian child from the lowest schools onwards, school days onwards. Secondly, the mass media can play a very influential role in this. And I must say, to its credit, this is one of the things the mass media, by and large, have been doing all right. They have largely been speaking for Indian pluralism and not amplifying the voices of bigotry and hatred, though there have been dishonorable exceptions, but by and large, they've been in the right place. And then, ideally, the political leadership of the country should stand up for the right values. It's frightening when people associated with the government and power themselves preach bigotry and hatred. That can be extremely, extremely damaging. But the sad truth that these kinds of thinking and words exist even after 7 decades of officially attempting to preach tolerance and coexistence suggests that there is a problem that can't just be eradicated by bromides. It will be a daily struggle. We'll have to work on it all the time. But we can't afford to give up if we want to preserve the India we know and love.
Mr. Tharoor, you've spoken about, the British legacy of divide and rule. How different is what the Congress or the BJP is doing now from what the British did to us 50 years or 60 years ago? And, I've heard you for the last 1 hour. When you chastise the BJP, it's pretty much on the grounds of divide and rule, which the Congress itself has stood for over the last 50 years. So how different, what is it different that you stand for? Because all I hear is political talk today. When we speak about people like you, we want to hear something different. But all I've heard today is probably what an uneducated leader would talk about as well, which is divide and rule.
No, well, I'm sorry you saw it that way, because that anyone who's read me over the years know that's not what I stand for or believe in. I'm a passionate advocate and I hope articulator of a vision of plural India, going back to more than 25 years of published books. So let me stress that for me, my vision has always been of a land of multiple identities, multiple truths, all of which have every right to coexist. I have written in India from Midnight to the Millennium 18 years ago that given, for example, Nehruji's attitudes to caste and communalism, that if he hadn't been cremated, he'd be turning over in his grave. Because the fact is that we have indeed enshrined a politics where group identities have been exploited for political reasons. But the big difference is, whereas there has been opportunistic political pandering, and I would certainly not exempt the Congress from it, but I would consider them amongst the mildest of the offenders by comparison with parties that are founded on the basis of caste or appeal to religion or other kinds of identity politics. The Congress has been amongst the very few that has not chosen to practice the politics of identity. The BJP was built on a Hindutva identity platform for the longest time. The Congress party always claimed to be a party for everybody, and which everybody had an equal place and opportunity. And indeed, the Congress party has a pretty proud record of pointing to having made chief ministers, presidents, prime ministers, ministers, governors, and so on, of every conceivable community, caste, and creed. So we do stand for something different. But I was answering the questions I was asked, and to my mind, the critique that I have articulated to Mr. Modi is a valid one. What do we offer in exchange? We offer in exchange a politics that goes beyond this. In fact, it's interesting to see Rahul Gandhi, for example, consciously eschewing the temptation to play the classic political card. So, for example, when he supported the striking sanitation workers of Delhi who hadn't been paid for 2 months, in the old days, that would have been seen as a Dalit cause. And you would have had Dalit front organizations and Dalit agencies, and it would have been highlighted that these people are all Dalits. The word was never mentioned. They were sanitation workers. He defined them by their profession and by the injustice of their not being paid a wage when the government was living so well and blowing up so much of money. So it was, in some ways, an important transformational moment in our politics. The Congress consciously moving beyond a caste articulation to a professional articulation. And I hope that we'll see more and more of that. Let's get people together. It doesn't matter if you're a Dalit or a Muslim or a Brahmin. If you're sweeping the streets, you have rights as a sweeper of the streets, and we will stand up for those rights. That kind of politics will make a difference.
Shashi, thank you. I think we have the vote of thanks.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Just to introduce myself, my name is Anuj Podar. Professionally, I'm involved in running a media and entertainment company. But I spend some of my free time contributing to the Ananta Aspen Centre. And I chair the programs committee, which means I'm involved in trying to, one of my primary initiatives right now is to step up the level of engagement in programs and activities that we have in Mumbai. And Aditya spoke about that initially. So firstly, I want to thank all of you for being here today. I want to thank Dr. Tharoor for making his time and making the trip to Mumbai, because getting that initiative, getting the Mumbai set of programs going is very important personally to me also. Dr. Tharoor, I have a confession. In preparation for this session, I picked up your book a couple of weeks ago. And unfortunately, given my schedule, I did not manage to go much beyond the contents page so far. But I was reading through the contents page, and I see some of you having the book. It's a very long, elaborate list of topics that you really talk about there. And yes, and I was thinking, how are you ever possibly going to touch upon all of this in this 1-hour session? But as I think about it, and as many of us have watched films and movies that have been adapted and made from books, and I think watching the movie makes us actually, for those of you who have not read the book, makes us want to go back and read that book, that if the movie was so nice, how much nicer must the book be? And post this session, rest assured that I want to read that book all the more. And I think to Vivek's question there, maybe it sounded like this was a political debate today, but I assure you the book has a lot more to it. And as a compliment, and I mean this as a compliment, Dr. Tharoor was a writer and author, and much before he became a politician. And if you feel so, then rest assured that that makes the book all the more worth reading than just any other political book that you might come across. So just talking a little more on the Ananta Aspen Centre and our objectives, and Aditya touched upon that briefly. I live in the media business, and what I see around us and all of you see around you, that we live in a society that is nowadays very surrounded by social media, WhatsApp, breaking news on news hour debates, etc. And what's happening as a result of that, that all our conversations are getting very shaped and guided by that format of media or sound that we have. And sometimes that's a lot of noise and cacophony. And what that does over a longer period of time, and I feel this very strongly, is that it's reducing our conversations to very binary, simplistic, and I would say even shallow level of conversations and debates around us. And it's good to have that. It's efficient on time, but it's equally important for us to go a little deeper, dig a little deeper, have a slightly more analytical set of conversations, have a slightly more deeper debate on issues. And that's what we at Ananta Aspen Centre are trying to do, is to provide a platform for such dialogue, provide a platform for these debates, provide a platform for some analytical conversation. You don't always have to agree with what's spoken. That's the other aspect. It's becoming a very binary set of opinions on social media. I think credit goes back to George Bush, the post 9/11, that there's a philosophy that you are either with us or against us. And I don't agree. You don't have to agree or disagree with everything. I think if you have a conversation, if that makes you think, if that makes you rethink what you believe, our job is done. You can go back from this evening not necessarily having agreed to what was spoken on the stage. You don't have to disagree with it. You can just go back and maybe if we've managed to make you think, reflect, pause, and reassess your thoughts and do that over a period of time, then our job is done. And that connects back to what our core objective is. Our core objective is to build what we call the good society, and this is something we borrow from the Aspen Institute US, that to build the good society. And what is a good society? It's a society that's a collective group of thoughts. So it's mindsets. That's what a society really represents. And mindsets come from thoughts, and thoughts come from conversation. And that's the link we're trying to complete for all of you. And if we can move that needle forward, then I think as a society we're moving forward. And then we are moving towards what we call the good society. And that brings us to our second objective, which is to drive and contribute to values-based leadership. So I think a good society and values-based leadership always go hand in hand. And therefore, this conversation, this dialogue, this debate, rethinking is extremely important for all of us, and that's something I hope to do more and more. So I hope to have a lot more speakers, a lot more interesting sessions for all of you. And that comes back to all of you. It's not just about the speakers on the stage. We would love to have many more of you participate more regularly with all of us. We take feedback from these things, so please feel free to feedback us post this session on whatever you think about it. One of the feedbacks I've taken this evening is that it's been fairly warm today, but as we said, we're going to try and fix some of these things. So let me just thank, firstly, all of you for being a very attentive and participative audience. Let me thank Dr. Tharoor for coming down to Mumbai, as I said. And as I was listening to him, two thoughts struck me. That, and like I said, I think many of you don't necessarily agree with him on every point, but I think he makes for a very compelling speaker. He makes you rethink. He probably may have been a good debating person in school. That forces you to rethink. And secondly, that comes across to me is that he has a very deep perspective on a very wide set of issues, and that's very rare to come across, far beyond what a regular politician has. On a lighter note, and I don't think you know this, but Dr. Tharoor, three of us share the same school, so Dr. Tharoor, Aditya, and myself, coincidentally, and that's Campion School. And four of us, five of us, six of us, seven of us, excellent. Yeah. And I think I'm going to be a little selfish and take some credit, or give some credit to our school possibly in setting the foundation for some of that deep thinking and analytical ability. Thank you also, James and Manjeet, for your polite grilling of Dr. Tharoor and for making the time to do that. I want to thank the Asia Society and Mr. Kale and Mrs. Balporia for partnering with us on these events, and we look forward to doing a lot more of that with your support and with your partnership. Thank you, Aditya. Thank you, Aditya Somani and his company, Everest Industries, and the team at Everest for supporting this event. You've supported events in the past, and we look forward to your continued support. And last but not the least, I want to thank our team at the Ananta Aspen Centre for helping put this together. Thank you very much.